Welcome everyone. Welcome to our workshop on the first day of this CartONG event, which has been great so far. Today's workshop will be about building responsible data reflexes. So my name is Paola. I have my colleague Laura here. We both work at the Engine Room, which is an international nonprofit organization that supports civil society actors around the world to use data and tech in a more responsible and strategic way. And today we want to talk to you about responsible data. I'm not sure if you are all familiar with the term. If you are not, then you're in the right place. If you are, welcome. Let's talk about responsible data. Today's workshop, as you may have read in the abstract, is really geared towards newcomers to the field. I know it can be quite a complex thing to tackle, not knowing where to go when you want to learn about how to really be responsible in your use of tech and data. So we designed a workshop together with organizers aimed to those people. Just a little overview of the workshop before we begin. After we give an introduction to responsible data and the responsible data principles, we will also share with you a few examples of what responsible data can look like in practice. So how have organizations implemented responsible data in their own way and in their own context. Then, and this will hopefully be fun, we'll have an exercise. We'll go into 2 breakout rooms, and Laura and I will brainstorm in 2 groups about what some responsible data challenges look like and how you tackle them in a hypothetical scenario. And then to wrap up the workshop, we'll have some concluding remarks. We'll share some resources, and then there will also be room for questions. To that end, just as Johan said, please feel free to use the chat box to share your questions with us. That way, towards the end of the workshop, we can look over them together and answer your questions to the best of our ability. So great. To start us off, I want to share with you all a definition of responsible data. Responsible data is, and I'm going to quote here, the duty to ensure people's rights to consent, privacy, security, and ownership around the information processes of collection, analysis, storage, presentation, and reuse of data, while respecting values of transparency and openness. This is a definition that the Engine Room, together with other members of the responsible data community, came up with back in 2014, when the responsible data community convened and worked on the principles together. So when I say responsible data community, who I'm actually referring to is a cross-sectoral group of about 1,200 practitioners, academics, and representatives from civil society. That's quite a lot. And in the beginning, there were not nearly this many people. This grew in the last, I want to say, 7.5 years. And the reason why the community came to be in the first place was because across the sector, many different people and organizations realized that using data for social change work, that it offers many opportunities, but also many challenges. And so the community came together to try to find and develop practical ways to deal with the unintended consequences of using data in social change work. And then also to establish best practices and to share approaches between each other and between people who work in the sector. We first convened in 2014, and Since then, many different institutions and individuals have pioneered responsible data practice in their own work within their communities and organizations. And Laura will share a few examples of what it looks like in practice later in this workshop. And maybe just to clarify, the Engine Room as an organization stewards this community. So it's part of our work. It's one of our flagship programs, which we're very proud of. But the community is a community on its own, and we're very proud of the energy that runs through it. So how we do it, we offer space to those who use data in social change and advocacy to exchange knowledge and also resources through the mailing list, which you are welcome to join. There's also websites, a forum, and events. And the why, which we haven't come to yet, the why, as I mentioned before, is quite related to the challenges that we're all facing. We all have to comply to certain regulations and frameworks, whether we are in Europe and we have to deal with the GDPR or outside of Europe. However, the law is only goes as far as it goes. We, as people who work in the social change or social justice sector, also have to adhere to other rights. The right to privacy, duty of care, things like that. That goes beyond what's in compliance. And even beyond rights, we also have to think about what is just and go to a justice-based approach. And that is why those are some of the questions and directions that we've thought about data and technology in the responsible data community. So just a few words. So next I want to run through the main principles of responsible data, but maybe to make it a bit less abstract, I'm going to share an example. So let's say in this scenario, we're all part of one humanitarian organization. We all work there, and the organization needs to collect data on every individual that they provide aid to. This is a very common scenario, I think, for many of us. Data is needed for organizations to run, to evaluate what they do. So what did it mean for this or for our organization to do the work according to principles of responsible data? First of all, we want to think about empowerment. Questions about how can we empower users to be active participants rather than passive data subjects, and ensure that we take everything into account. Here we go back to the duty of care that I referred to earlier. We really have to think about users as people who have all the same rights and privileges that anyone else in the world does. And as an organization working in the humanitarian field, that's something that we need to consider. Secondly, harm avoidance. We must do all we can to ensure that we do not harm, and that the way in which we use data and technology does not facilitate or exacerbate harm done by others. Of course, you know, I assume that many of you are familiar with the do no harm principles, and in that, it's also quite a nice example in this principle to show that when we talk about tech and data, it's really not a different world on its own. Really, these are all principles that are an extension of the ways and the values that we adhere to working in this field anyway. So I want to stress that tech and data and the work that we do with tech and data is really part of all the work we do, and it's not an unknown beast that we have to grapple outside of the way we already do things. The third principle is related to power dynamics. Again, something that we also have to consider when not talking about second data. When we're talking about responsible data, we have to always keep in mind who are the least powerful actors, how are they affected by the data, and how powerful are people making decisions. I think we've all, especially in recent years, been confronted with news news of data breaches, which showed that certain powerful actors in the tech world have quite a lot of power and can hold on to lots of data and use it not to the benefit of the people who actually are represented in the data. So power dynamics is a really important principle for responsible data. Next, we have the unknown unknowns, which really is about building checks and balances to alert if something unexpected is happening. Data travels in many ways, and it's really hard to get a grip of how it does so. And when we, as organizations, are responsible for the data and for the harm that it could potentially cause, it's really important that we keep that we have checks and balances to ensure that the harm is minimized. Then we have the precautionary principle. Can we sufficiently evaluate the risk and understand the harms? Which is quite related to the unknown unknowns principle. We have to always consider that if we don't have enough information on what potentially could be the risk of working with a specific type of technology, then maybe it's not the best idea to do it in the first place. If, for example, biometric registration, right? It's been quite a hot topic in the humanitarian world for a while. If we have no idea how, let's say, iris scans are collected and stored, then maybe it's not the best way to collect any information on the community. Then we have, also related to that, thoughtful innovation. We have to consider care and thought when implementing new technologies, not just thinking about the speed or flashiness of a new technology, such as, for example, iris scans. It's also a question that we're facing a lot with AI and machine learning these days. Then we have the principle of diversity and bias, thinking about perspectives that are missing. Building technology is not exempt from bias, and it's always important to remember that. And then finally, responsible data is also about building better behaviors. And I want to stress that it starts in very small ways, and that there's no one size fits all for responsible data. So we are all here together to think about these questions, and we don't have the same context. We don't work in the same organization. We don't work with the same communities. So in any case, the way that we behave and the way that we implement principles of responsible data in our work are going to be different. And depending on the culture, the context, and the organization where we work, the implication of that changes, and the ways in which data is used also changes. But that's also what makes it an exciting topic, and that's also why I'm excited for the exercise to come, because we all bring different ideas to the table, so we can get creative together about the solutions. And next, I'm going to give the mic to Laura, who will share with you a few words on what responsible data looks like in projects.
Thanks, Paola, and thanks for setting that good foundation. As Paola just mentioned, I'll be talking about RD and projects. This itself could probably fill, I don't know, a week of its own workshops, thinking really thoroughly about what responsible data in practice actually means. So keep in mind that what I am going to cover is an introduction. We encourage you to check out the website or the handbook If you have further questions or reach out to us, all of that as a caveat to say, we recognize that this will be kind of again, an intro, a quick look. So I'll be talking about designing a project and what to consider when you're thinking about responsible data in that process, managing data through its life cycle from acquiring the data, getting the data, analyzing it, understanding it, sharing it, storing it, all of that, and close with a couple of examples of policies and practices that we've worked with in the past that illustrate a bit of what Paola and I will have talked about. So to kick things off, we'll go to the next slide. And start with designing. So designing a project, any project, obviously it requires time, effort, people. Same thing will hold true when you're designing with responsible data principles in mind. A couple of ones that I want to highlight that will resonate with what Paola just shared is, from the beginning, remembering not to design alone. It's important to remember to bring other people into the imaginary or real room with you as you design. Think about who is in the room, who's missing, what that could mean. Related to people, when you're thinking about these things, make sure to get permission. Get permission from the people that you are working with. Get permission in the example that Paola shared of a humanitarian organization. Get permission from the individuals about whom you're collecting data, whether you're providing them with aid or collaborating with them. Make sure that everyone is kind of on board for the purpose of the project. Something that we see missing sometimes is a budget, and by that we mean both financial and in terms of human time and human capacity. Thinking through how to design and how to implement a project responsibly can take more time, especially if it's the first or second time that you're doing that. So keep that in mind when you're budgeting time of your team members and budgeting financials as well. And finally, check in with yourself. Remember that this isn't something that you want to evaluate just at the end, but throughout the process of designing the project and implementing it. Keep checking in. Is this a decision we're proud of? Are we upholding the principles that we want to uphold? That kind of thing. A second thing to keep in mind while designing a project is the importance of a plan. Related to the budget, keep a timeline in mind that allows for extra stuff to come up, because it will, especially again when you're doing something new. Plan for failure, not aim for failure, but keep in mind that things will go wrong, things could go wrong, and have a plan, a backup plan, a second backup plan for things like having a lapse in asking for that permission. What happens if someone in the field didn't ask for permission? Consider what you might do in that situation. Third, as you're designing a project, ask yourself, why are we talking about data? Keep data in mind. It could be the case that you've jumped to collecting data without necessarily having a question. So making sure that you take a step back and you actually have a starting point from which you're collecting data is really important. And last, in project design, document the process. And of course, that will carry through project implementation and closing, but it starts at the very beginning of having a plan of who will be doing the documenting, where, how, what kinds of things you want to capture. And that's also particularly important for learning. Once you get to the end of a project and you want to do something similar, you will have something to go back to and learn from. So next up, managing data. Sometimes people think data management is really boring because you think about hard drives or cloud systems or a lot of kind of vague things, but it's really important to projects, especially projects that are dealing with humans and their interests and their lives, which a lot of the work that we're talking about in humanitarian work, aid work, NGOs, civil society organizations, all of that is there. So one thing to keep in mind is that the way that you plan to manage data in a project has really big implications for data integrity. So by this, we mean the validity, authenticity, and security of information. So take an example, if there's an organization collecting data on human rights abuses, that data needs to be held in a way that can be used by other parties and can be trusted by that. And that again is data integrity in that case, ensuring that it's valid and making sure that it can be trusted. So managing data might seem boring, but we promise it's important. And I'm sure all of you have plenty of examples for thinking of when that became important. The kind of stage of data storage also carries the potential for a fair amount of risk. Depending on how data is stored, there is a potential for loss of data. A hard drive can just go missing or can be stolen. Depending on the way data is stored, let's say in the cloud, it could be threatened by legal action, and the place where it's being stored may be required to give it up, and that might not be what you want. There could be a data breach or some sort of malicious attack. So it's important to think, to remember that side of data storage too. It's important to consider because you want to mitigate against those harms. So a couple, again, each of these I could go into more, but a couple of things to keep in mind when you are planning for data storage is whether you want to store it physically or store it digitally. It could be a paper survey. You could digitize said survey. The digital version you could store locally, offline. It could be stored online. So thinking through which of those combinations of location and format make sense for your project and your context can be important. Ultimate ownership of storage. So if you were to host your data on a platform online, make sure you understand the rights that you and the rights that the company storing the data have. It can be sometimes a bit of a gray area if you don't fully understand what rights they have to your data, if they can view it, if they can give it up to law enforcement if they're required to. So understanding any third-party actor who's involved in the storage of your data, what not rights they have, but what kind of access they have. Planning around backups is also important. Not the most glamorous, but do you have it online? If so, do you also want to have it on a hard drive? If you have, again, going back to the paper copies, do you want to keep the paper copies in a safe somewhere so that you can have a redundant backup of the digitized version, that kind of thing. And kind of relatedly to that is the question of access, which sometimes gets glossed over, but is important to think about who within your team and who within your organization has access to which versions of the data. Ideally, we all trust the folks on our team, but that's still an important way to kind of further protect any data you have stored against some of the risks that we talked about previously. And finally, considering the process of storage throughout the life cycle. You have the collection phase, you'll store it. As the project closes, you might want to publish it, you may want to archive the data, and remembering that each of those stages could have implications on the way that you're storing the data. Okay, so in this hypothetical world, we have a plan. We've designed our project. We have a plan for managing our data. Now we can start collecting our data, getting our data. As I think both of us have touched on already, it's important to start with, what's your question? Oftentimes, there can be a lot of excitement in running out and going and collecting data and doing surveys and seeing what's working, seeing what's not working, seeing what people need. But if that doesn't start with a specific concrete question, we've found that that can lead to things like collecting too much data, collecting data that could actually end up harming the folks that you're working with. It could lead to collecting data in a way that the people from whom you're collecting the data don't really feel comfortable. So starting with a fairly concrete question that is relevant to the work you and your team and your organization are doing, and that is flexible enough to allow for the needs of the folks whom you're collecting data from. It's really important. Once you have that question and you've agreed upon it with your teammates, another design phase can begin, and that is designing the data collection process. I'm sure many of you are familiar with designing surveys and how that's kind of a brainy exercise on one side of making sure that the questions are the questions that get information you need, and the practical side of going out and using a mobile app or using pen and paper. But there's also the side of thinking about the data collector and their needs and their well-being and what they may or may not be exposed to as they're collecting data. And there's considering the people that you are working with and that from whom you're collecting the data. I'm going to jump down to consent on that point to say that consent, particularly in humanitarian work, can be pretty tricky, depending on the ways that we are collecting data and to what end we're planning to use that data. But in its ideal, the folks from whom you're collecting information are able to freely give consent in a way that can be reversible. They can follow up if they want to rescind their consent. They understand what they're consenting to, what they're sharing, where that information will go, how it will be analyzed. It's enthusiastic, so it's not just kind of a default, I guess, but it's a proactive yes, and specific. So it's not, you're a surveyor from your organization, you get one consent, yes, and then in perpetuity, that does not mean you get to just keep asking questions. Of course, that just means for that particular project. Jumping back, designing a data collection process can also mean working with existing data. So talking to peer organizations or seeing what publicly available information is out there can also be part of this process. And it can, depending on, of course, validating the data that you get externally and all of that, it can actually make the process of getting data a bit easier. Alrighty, next slide. Okay, so we have planned our project. We planned our management of our data. We collected the data, and now what do we have on our hands? The answer could be a lot of different things, but for the sake of this conversation, it's important to think about, let's say, at least three things. The first is verifying the data that you have. Again, this is important for similar reasons that data storage is important, is that you want to make sure that your data is valid, that it is reflective of realities on the ground. Ways that you can do that are always keeping in mind that you're always saving an original set of the data, but you can go in and look yourself and see what conclusions might be drawn from that and reality check that with what you and your peers know about the situation at hand. You could talk to the data collector to learn about things that they saw while they were on the ground that maybe they didn't get to strictly survey. If you come across anything that's unclear or confusing or that you feel is unrealistic, there is hopefully space to return to sources or to talk with, again, peer organizations, data collectors, to verify and validate what you found. Cleaning data is a phase of projects that can be somewhat time consuming. I see Paola nodding her head. In the ideal, it's something that you could design for at the very beginning. So something like making sure that data that is collected about birth dates always has the exact same format and having a way to enforce that, right? There are steps we can proactively take to reduce the cleaning load afterwards. But at least in my experience, even the most thoughtfully designed, validated data collection processes still do require a bit of manual reviewing and manual, just human eyeballs to make sure that what we've got is actually meaningful and is actually accurate. And again, thinking about the question of budgeting, this is a phase that sometimes gets under budgeted because folks don't like to necessarily think about the time that it may take to clean data. So time and financial wise cleaning data is an important phase there. And lastly, on understanding data, this is a very big one, managing bias and I would say checking assumptions. It would be worth, if this is something that you're keen to learn more about, jumping into the handbook that has a lot more information on this. But thinking about bias and thinking about the assumptions that we enter these projects with is particularly important when thinking about responsible data, because bias and assumptions are so hard to not embed in our projects. So ideally, this is something that you've talked about with your team before starting a project, and it's something that you can pull back when you're looking at the project data, the findings, quote unquote, so that you can see again, did any of our biases manifest? Have our assumptions manifested? It's helpful to have a community of trusted folks that you can talk to about concerns here, because this is all a really pernicious way that we can accidentally bring in some level of harm or some level of prejudice that isn't explicitly something that we're trying to do, but that we inherently bring in due to our own assumptions. Alrighty, last two steps of our hypothetical project. First is sharing data, and then next we'll be closing the project. But for sharing data, we mean this both internally to the project and also externally in terms of publication. So starting with the former, internally, who has access to which data? And I touched upon this earlier, but at this point of a project, you likely will have kind of the raw data, some analyzed sets, some that maybe have been synthesized into conclusions, and some that's ready for public sharing. And each of those will likely have different levels of sensitivity, have different levels of identifying information. So the raw data could, depending on how it's collected, could potentially have very sensitive identities within it, whereas something that's being prepared to be shared externally may not have that. So thinking through all of those different kinds of data and presentations of it, who internally has access to it, and what that means in terms, again, of risk to your organization, perhaps to the data collectors themselves, and most importantly, to the people whose realities and lives are reflected in the data. Before sharing data, again, internally and externally, I would say, think about three considerations. The first is data minimization. And that's, again, tied to that point I made earlier about the importance of having a question. If you have a clear, concrete question, ideally you're only collecting data and information that is pertinent to that question. By minimizing the amount of data that we collect, we can take a step towards minimizing the risk that we face as an organization, again, and also to the folks that we are, in this example, providing aid to. I think that's a very important principle in its apparent simplicity, but once we start building surveys, I know us curious humans are want to add many, many questions. So it's important to go back and ask, do we really need this data, this piece of data, or will it just bring extra harm? Data anonymization, very, very bulky topic. I encourage everyone to read more, but the importance of, where possible in each collection of data, anonymizing what you have, removing as much of identifying information as you can. And the last one, which I think we already talked about, is informed consent. Informed consent when you are doing the survey, and also informed consent perhaps at that point, or following back up and asking about sharing, and if they are comfortable having their data shared in whatever way that it's been decided. So last up, closing a project. closing a project, we'll be talking about RAD, which stands for retention, archival, and disposal or deletion. As the last point says, this is something that is worth thinking about way back at the beginning, taking into account the end before you start. Retention, as you're ending the project, the active part of it, what data are you keeping? What data are you archiving? And finally, what data are you disposing of or deleting? Not a lot of people love to delete their data, but it can be a nice way to, again, minimize the risk that everyone involved in these projects face. All right, I know we're getting close to exercise o'clock, but I'm going to go over 4 quick examples of RD in practice. So the first 2 are policies, and we will share links to all of these later on, so you don't have to panic that you'll never see them again. But the first 2 are policies that we worked with Oxfam and GIZ with. And we encourage you to look at them because it's interesting to see how very similar, not very similar, but the same principles can inform different approaches to responsible data. At the end of the day, a policy that is about responsible data is meant to help a team or an organization carry out a shared approach to their project and to their data. It's not meant to be an externally rigid set of rules, but something that adheres to the culture of the organization, their values, their mission, what resources they have at hand. Maybe there are teams that can support them, maybe there aren't, and whatever specific risks and knowledge they face. So again, none of this is meant to be a one-size-fits-all solution, but instead a starting point for, it could be policies, as in these 2 examples, or also practices. Maybe a whole organization isn't ready to adopt a policy, or maybe a whole team isn't ready to adopt a policy, but a couple of people can come together to design decision-making tools. We worked with the American Association for the Advancement of Science to build decision trees that were meant to kind of help people think through their projects and different decision points, how they would make more responsible decisions. We worked with Ariadne to build conversation guides, which, again, they're not policies, they're not these binding big things that take a lot of time, but they're things to just keep in mind as their team members were having conversations about grant making. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paola, who's going to share with us an exercise on how we can think about what RD looks like in practice.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for warming us up, because the exercise is actually quite related to everything you just told us about responsible data in projects. In this next exercise, which we'll go into breakout rooms for, we will be discussing a prompt. This is a hypothetical scenario of a project manager asked to share data, and we will be discussing 3 things. Through a brainstorm, we'll talk about what are some things that could go wrong, thinking about vulnerabilities. Then we'll talk about what is the best way of sharing information. And finally, we will also brainstorm about things to consider before sharing data. So let's dive into the prompt. I'm going to read it out. You can also read it on the slides. Not to worry, when you break into breakout rooms, Laura and I will be there to facilitate each room. So we can always read the prompt for you if you've forgotten it. But without further ado, here it is. So you are a project manager at a large humanitarian organization. You have recently, for some unknown reason, been asked to start working from home. And you want to share a file with information with a colleague who is also now working from home. The file itself contains interview transcripts from your recent mission in Mali. So as I mentioned before, we will be looking for 3 things. We want to learn about some things that could go wrong and vulnerabilities in the process of sharing the data. We want to learn about the best way to go about sharing the data. And we also want to hear some things that you should consider before sharing. Before we start, I also want to stress that there is no one right answer. This exercise is designed for everyone to, as the title of the workshop mentions, build some reflexes and get, to start brainstorming about what some things are that you can build into your processes to be more responsible the ways you manage and share your data. So Johan, I think we will just wait for you to pull us into 2 breakout rooms, and then we can get started. Great. I hope you all had a great discussion. I know it was quite short, and it's ideally we'll be in a room together in person, but I'm really astounded by the fantastic answers that I got from my little group. So I'm excited to also hear about the other group. So next, we're going to take some time to do a little share back. Then we will also share some resources with you, and then we'll have time for questions. And then, as Laura and I mentioned right before we started, the workshop will have flown by. So unfortunately, we're nearing the end of our little session. So as I was part of group 1, I will just share some thoughts on the fantastic remarks that that my group shared. So maybe Laura, we can talk about vulnerabilities one after the other, and then we can both talk about the second question. That might be a bit more dynamic. So when talking about vulnerabilities, my group talked about 3 topics. We touched on infrastructure. So indeed, in this situation, the person the project manager working from home may be working from their personal computer. We talked about whether or not the IP was protected, the Wi-Fi was protected as well, and how infrastructure really is key to having a responsible work atmosphere. We also talked quite a lot about access. So making sure that the person accessing the file is doing so through a secure channel. For example, when all of a sudden working remotely, maybe some people start using Dropbox when that's perhaps not the best or the safest option. And then finally, we also talked about, I can't read my own writing. Consent. We talked about consent. Consent not only from the perspective of the colleague, but also from the perspective of the persons who are reflected in the interview transcript. Do they know that what they said or what they shared in the interview is being shared with someone else in the organization or not? So those are some of the vulnerabilities that we touched on. Laura, do you want to share a couple of yours?
Yeah, I think ours were somewhat similar. We talked about, if I borrow your top three of the things we talked about. One was what actually is the information that we're talking about. It could be an audio file, it could be a written transcript. The transcript could contain names and metadata like location and time and all of that, and how, depending on the differences or the different answers to those questions, it could mean you may or may not be able to use certain tools. It could require more sensitivity and more care. And relatedly talked about well, I guess this is getting to solutions, but talked about how, well, I'll save that. Okay. And then we talked about the vulnerability of the file in transit and also in storage, thinking about how you might have a really secure solution to sharing the file, but the person receiving the file might just leave it in broad daylight on their desktop, right, of their laptop. And also we talked about infrastructure, the differences between sitting, let's say, in Geneva versus being somewhere that has a lower internet connection or a less stable one, and what that can mean about what options you have for sharing.
Awesome. Great. So moving on to the next question, we also discussed what are some of the best ways of sharing the data. And we had a really fascinating discussion, because we kind of made a distinction between what the organization may say is the best way to go about sharing information versus what the individual is presented with in their particular context and situation, and with the data that they have at hand. So we recognize that if an organization has a policy in place, that's great, or guidelines, or anything that tells them, hey, you are not alone in making this decision. We are not expecting you to know everything when it comes to responsible data, and the onus of making those decisions does not sit on your shoulders. And one of our participants, Mark, shared his own experience and talked to us about how for their specific organization, there is, looking at the tools, what are the most secure tools, but also having good policies in place. And finally, also the human resources. So making sure that you have people who are equipped and aware and know how to use all of the above. And then we also, when talking about the individual's decisions that they are faced with, we also talked about how they actually have more agency than sometimes is recognized. And we gave some examples, how, for example, the person, before sharing the file, they can also stop and think, I do have all of these guidelines, and I guess I know in general what the best way of sharing the data is. But you can also always stop and decide to not share all of the data. That refers to the data minimization that Laura mentioned earlier. You can also decide to anonymize the data before sharing it. And that in itself can be such a powerful decision that doesn't require that much time, but can have a really meaningful impact. Laura, how about your group?
We talked a lot about technical solutions and also how they interact with context, with what, again, going back to the point of, let's say this were an audio recording, that could really limit what tools are at your disposal to share, because those files might be really big. So remembering, I think what our conversation reflected was remembering that responsible practices are contextual practices, and that you might have a process that says always use whatever X tool to share files, end of sentence. That might not always consider all of the different realities of the file and who's doing the sharing. But we did also touch on minimizing data and how from the get-go, people don't always need the full data set. Maybe it's an external partner that you want to vet the data or double check the data. They don't need to know all of the names and places and times and all of that. You can just share a subset of the data and do some amount of kind of protection that way. Since we did focus on things like tools, we talked about Signal, we talked about encrypted vaults, we talked about VPNs. We also touched on the importance of there being a tech person, whether it's one wearing a real tech person hat or one who's just known to be particularly technologically savvy on the team, to answer questions and to troubleshoot, and how sometimes that's not a reality that some people have. Yeah, I would say that that's it, kind of acknowledging the variability in what the practices can actually look like in practice, despite there definitely potentially seeming like there is a gold standard, and perhaps people believe that there is one gold standard, but needing to adapt that standard to what their actual day-to-day is like.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we have our last question, things to consider before sharing the data. In our case, we spent quite a lot of time on the first two questions, but the answers to question 3 were mainly about responsibility. Who actually has an overview of how the data is managed. So two things were mentioned in particular. One is, where will the data go? So having a clear idea of how it will be used is quite important. Again, this is another example of the small acts of agency that you can take by just asking your colleague before giving them a file with potentially sensitive information, just asking them, oh, why do you need it? Can you share with me who you will share it with, or if you will do that? And just preparing for that by already taking into account those questions. And another example of how to be responsible for the management of this data is related to data links. So for example, if you break off a piece of data and you share it into the world, then making sure that you know the context that it belongs to and you have that overview is also important. That's another thing we talked about. Laura?
I think I wrapped up a lot of our answers to this question in my last point, but if I were to parse it out, some of the considerations we talked about were, what is the data, like understanding very well what it is that you are sharing before attempting to do so. And also kind of policies, and what it sounded like most people in the room had some sort of organizational standard or policy, and using that as a starting point. Like you said earlier, it might not be the end point. There could be small acts within that or small changes. And yeah, I guess third consideration was all of the contextual factors of the endless variability in each of our contexts.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for your really wise suggestions. I know I learned a lot. So we've come to almost the end of our session. To wrap us up, a few words on what it means to actually build responsible data reflexes. There are 4 things. If you remember one slide from this entire workshop, I want it to be this one, because we want to make sure that you know that adhering to responsible data principles does not have to be something that's scary or big or takes a lot of resources. As we mentioned throughout the workshop, it can start as a small act that you take as an individual, and it can have a huge impact and actually, maybe inspire your colleagues to also start thinking about these topics. So we have 4 principles that we want to share. Number 1, perfect is the enemy of good. No one knows everything about technology or what will happen if you do a certain thing, if you share a piece of data. A lot of the work that you do when dealing with responsible data is hypothetical. We can only do the best we can, and I think it's important to remember that and not be paralyzed by fear. Number 2, you'll go further together. As Laura mentioned in the very beginning of the workshop, it's always better to design a project together. Find buddies, join the responsible data community, ask questions. We are all here together today. There are also plenty of events throughout the year where you can find kindred spirits, peers who are facing similar challenges, so you're never alone. 3, as I mentioned before, small changes can have a large impact. Again, this is sometimes hard to measure, and sometimes we think that maybe they don't because we are dealing with hypotheticals, but small changes certainly ripple through. And finally, there's no one size fits all. Responsible data looks different for every organization, depending on your context, depending on your on the risks that you're facing, depending on the communities that you work with. So customize it. Find a way that works for you and for your organization. Again, you can have the perfect policy, the perfect tools, but if no one knows how to use it or how to operationalize it, then it's not a fit for you. So take into account the realities of your work before adopting solutions. So I also want to share a few resources here. You can always reach us through the engine room site and through the responsible data website. As Laura also referred to a couple of times, there is a responsible data handbook, which is really the perfect resource if you're new to the topic of responsible data and you have specific questions about handling data in projects. Then there is also the mailing list, which, as we mentioned before, has a healthy, big community of practitioners, and anyone is welcome to join, anyone is welcome to ask questions. Then we also have a Mission Responsible newsletter, which shares stories of organizations dealing with responsible data. And of course, you can always tweet at us through the responsible data hashtag. I know we have only 5 minutes left, but have we seen questions through the chat? Let me check. I don't think we have, but if anyone has a question for us, please share it in the chat or unmute. If not, that's also fine. I know it's quite late for most of us, so don't worry about it. For now, I will stop sharing my screen. Any questions? I think my neighbor has a question. Here's some shouts. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all. Oh, Johan? Oh, and Mark is leaving. Well, I suggest we wrap it up because I know many of you have had a very long day. But I want to thank you all for joining us today, for engaging, and I hope that you learned a lot. Please, as I mentioned before, don't hesitate to reach out to Laura or to myself. We'd be happy to accompany you in how you're tackling responsible data in your work in the near future. Also, thank you to everyone from CartONG for supporting us to host this workshop. It's been nice to see your faces.